everybody who's taken the time out to watch this fireside with Alasdair and I. Today we're talking about an IAM migration, identity and access management migration. Not as a technology refresh, but actually talking about the business transition. Because when organizations look at moving identity platforms, whether it's from on-prem to, or maybe one identity provider to another, away from something that's been built highly bespoke or perhaps legacy, then what they feel is very rarely excitement about doing that. Usually it's hesitation, fear, and that hesitation is something that we understand. We deal with on a daily basis here at Condatis with the customers that we work with. Identity sits across everything. It sits in the middle of operations, of security, of that general user experience, and so the fear is real. It's not just about, well, will the technology work? It's more about, well, what happens if we disrupt this identity fabric that holds absolutely everything together for us right now. So what we really want to unpack today is this: migration doesn't have to be a leap of faith. Done well, in a controlled transition, where there is clear ownership, where there is better visibility, where there is a resilient strategy, then it can be done without that fear. So I'm Stacey Quintana. I'm head of strategy architecture, and I'm joined by Alasdair. So Alasdair, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. Yeah, my name's Alasdair Murray. I'm Chief Technology and Product Officer at Condatis.
Cool. So let's talk about the real world then. So I guess let's start with the fear itself, because that's usually where we start, right, Alasdair? That's where all the conversations generally begin for us. Um, so I think why does identity and access management, which I refer to as IAM, because it's a bit of a mouthful to keep saying that all the way through, why does migration for IAM feel particularly risky? So um, often it gets treated sometimes too, I guess, risky to touch. In reality, is it really that leaders are, just generally worried about different aspects of what the migration means, what risk it brings, what decisions need to be made, and which of these fears are valid? So I think from my perspective, what I see is that actually the customers we engage with and the organizations that we work with are rarely worried necessarily about the technology, because there are thousands of different technologies that you can choose from today, and all, of a good standard. So what they're actually worried about is losing that control. They're worried about, if authentication breaks, if users can't do their work, if privileged access gets muddied, if they haven't got that confidence for audit, for example, or bringing new risk whilst trying to remove old risk from a platform that they've been working with over the last, say, 20 years in some cases. So quite often I think fear can be quite amplified, because that current state, albeit very fragile, and actually we know there's quite a lot of risk there and we need to migrate, we need to move on, it's so familiar. So people know what those workarounds are. They know who to call in true Ghostbuster style. They know which bits, are held together, because they've got that, kind of tribal knowledge, if you will. So what sometimes we see, or I in particular see, is that, it's not resistance to migration. It's actually a lack of confidence that we can move forward without having some sort of organizational shock in the process of doing so. So I think from your perspective, Alasdair, when leadership teams hesitate around that IAM migration, what do you see sitting underneath that? Is it security? Is it operational? Is it commercial fear? Or is it a mixture of all of them, or something else? What's your takes?
So I think what we basically see a lot of the time with our clients is a mixture of all of those things. If you think about, I think migration really brings to the fore the fact that identity is so critical at the heart of organizations. So, when you start to actually dig into it and you start to think about it as a management team of, okay, we want to do a migration, we want to make a change. What's the risk of that change? What's going to actually happen? And, if you're thinking about, well, is this going to actually impact my users being able to log onto the system? Does that actually impact, operationally how my company is going to work, or how our organization is going to work, or even thinking slightly wider, if you're thinking about customers or partners, these are core and critical parts of organizations and about how they run today. It's part and parcel of organizations today that digital interaction and the identities associated with that interaction really are fundamental to the operational uh, capacity of the company and how they run and their security. So it that that as you say, there's a fear factor there, right? We're thinking about changing that. We're thinking about actually changing something, or why are we making that change? What benefit will we get from that change, and how will the
Yeah.
company look after that change? So,
Mm.
you know, those things all come to the fore through a migration, because it's not just about a technical change. It's not just about a technical control that the company are going to apply. It's actually fundamental to how that company sort of works and operates, and potentially how they're generating revenue, but also how they're keeping their data secure. So it's a big thing in people's minds about we're about to change something so fundamental about our business. And how do we explain that to all the stakeholders that are out there?
Yeah.
There's a whole range of stakeholders. It's not just a technical decision. It's is this going to change how our workforce actually work day to day? Is there going to add more friction? Is it going to be better? Is it going to be worse? Is it, how do I explain this to the CFO who's going to have to sign this off? There's a lot of different aspects that we see when we're talking to clients that really add to that slight fear, or reticence to start thinking about migrations with identity, when they start to understand the changes that could happen to their organizations.
Yeah, I very much see identity as kind of like when you think about like a loose thread on your fabric and you pull it and you're like, if I pull this, is it gonna fall
What's going
apart?
to happen? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So yeah, yeah, that's kind of the thread that goes throughout the entire organization, I suppose. But so if that fear is real, and we're thinking about, well, if we stay as we are, the risk's going to stay as it is. The real question then becomes, we've got to migrate. We can't carry the risk. We can't continue with operations as they are. We need to modernize. How do we actually make this change feel um, controlled, rather than disruptive? And I think that kind of nicely brings us on to a conversation we have quite a lot, which is, shall we do this in a big bang fashion all in one, or should we do this in a controlled manner? And if the answer isn't a big bang replacement, well, what does a controlled IAM transition actually look like in practice? So I mean, we've just been through this, recently on one of our projects, haven't we? But I think, this is a bit that I think often gets oversimplified. People talk about the migration, as if it's, one move. In reality, like we said about the thread, there's usually several different migrations that are all happening at once, in different areas of the business as well. So you might be moving, in an identity world, you might be moving, like I said earlier at the top of the call, from on-prem identity dependencies towards more of that cloud control. You might be thinking about, how do we change from one IDP to another IDP? You might be replacing something that's really, custom, that's been built for you, this custom engine, or even something legacy like MIM. The processes around governance, or that JML process, it might be, how do we modernize that? How do we automate this? How do we make this better for us operationally? And again, there's a lot of organizations, different industries will have things like applications that are, they can't move at the same pace as everything else. The business in general, day-to-day operations hangs on specific applications that, can't necessarily be modernized or move at the same pace. So when we come to that sort of strategic side of this, it's really about, we don't rip and replace. Actually, it's let's design something that is a transitional state, that we can govern along the way, that we can measure the impact of what we're doing, and that is survivable. We need to future proof. We can't put something in that isn't going to survive the test of time, particularly in a world where we're going at the pace we are today with technology. So I think one of the things that we usually see is this scenario where we have coexistence. And that can last for a period of time. So it means, what do we define as that new control plane when we're talking about identity? What remains as an integration with that control plane or as a dependency layer around that control plane? And what do we phase? And how do we phase it? Do we phase it based on risk? Do we phase it based on the value that we're going to get out of that as a business? Do we phase that on how ready we are as an organization for that particular transition? Um, so I guess to you, Alasdair, what does a good transition design look like? How do we
How
help
long's a piece of string?
organizations? Yeah, exactly. Back to the threads.
Okay, so I think for me, I think one of the things that always marks a good migration or a good starting point for the migration is the planning phase, because quite often or very regularly you'll see people starting to jump to technology immediately. What are the technology issues? What are the features that we need? Let's
Yeah,
solutionalize this.
yeah,
And that, especially when you're talking about a migration where it's not just about the technology, it's about actually how your business runs. It's about, the fundamentals of outcomes that you want for your business. And you've got to bring stakeholders potentially along from HR or finance or other parts of the organization. So for me, it all starts with, as you pointed to there, Stacey, it's about, well, what's our strategy here, right? Where are we going to
yeah,
start with this? How do we understand our organization, what we want from our organization? Because as you say, we've been doing some really large transitions recently and helping clients understand how they're going to plan for these sort of migrations or transitions within their businesses. It's a big thing. It can feel a really big and such quite an immense problem. So how do we look at that problem? How do we look and see how that problem can be broken down? And how does that work inside a fundamental strategy that we're wanting to get to? We're here today, we want to get to here. We're not going to suddenly go straight from one to the other. So it's how do we plan that and how do we look at our business and say, as you were talking about, we can plan that migration either around user groups, around countries, operating groups. We can plan it around how risk is perceived in the business. Has something happened? Has an auditor found something that we want to focus on first? So it's really about thinking about the business, about how we want the business, where we want the business to get to, but then how do we look at that transition? How do we make that transition work for the business? Because I don't think there is a one size fits all. We start here, we get to here. It's about matching your business or your organization with a process that gets you to where you want to go, basically.
yeah,
So what I would say is the other thing. So that's the first thing: is don't focus on the technology first. Focus on the outcome about or the strategy about what does your business want and what's the strategy that gives you that outcome. And I think the second thing that always gets underestimated in migrations is let's talk about data. The whole basis of identity and how organizations run is based on their data and where are your sources of truth and what are in your sources of truth. And one of the key questions that always comes up is actually who owns some of that data. I mean, these are quite fundamental questions within businesses, because if you can get to these points of clarity about where you want your source of truth to be and who owns that data, and then the technology really becomes a sort of secondary. Yes, you have to do the technology, but it's not. It's an implementation. It's purely an implementation thing. These are the areas that people in migrations really need to think about: is this preparation, this strategy part, your data, and how your organization runs, and how we could potentially break up this bigger problem into something that's manageable. And as you say, I don't think we would ever recommend, or we that people do a sort of a big switch over, a big bang approach. It's very much like your business has to run whilst this is happening. So how do we do this with things running in parallel? How do we do that in a way that's in cooperation, collaboration with your business, rather than just throwing all sorts of things in and switching it on and seeing what happens? It has to be a very conscious and a planned, stepped approach, because it's important and it's an important part of your business and an important part of the way your business runs.
yeah. Absolutely, and I think going back to the first point that you made around how, we would look at designing a transition, from a strategic perspective, it is very much about those business outcomes because it's really important that we understand, well, what are you looking to get out of this? What are we achieving from this at the end? Because we've seen that real shift over the last kind of decade or so around how identity has been, gone from this back office kind of function, these clever little wizards over there in the corner doing what they do from an identity and access management perspective. And now identity and access management is really coming to that forefront really. And it's now not a question of how do we implement these technical controls, but actually how do we make IAM a business enabler overall? And I think that's what sometimes can drive the priorities around that transition, as well as things like risk, obviously. But it's that real shift in how identity has kind of changed over the last few years, right?
For sure, I think one of the things that identity was always in that security framing, in terms of, like, we're just looking at this from in terms of risk. But if you think about what's happening in the industry, well, in the world right now, like the way things like AI and to bring innovation into organizations and things like that, like people are pushing for that. Like there's some really exciting things that businesses can do, but how do we do that in a sort of a safe and secure way at scale, right? Is the important thing that's going on right now. So um, that is really pushing identity just from being a risk management tool to being a right. Well, it's actually part of our innovation. It's part of our how do we supply the latest technologies to our businesses so that they can launch new services or have a more frictionless experience so that customers or partners or our workforce are able to work from wherever they are, but we're doing that in a secure way. So it's really part of that. I think the way I'm looking at it at the moment, or I'm thinking about it at the moment, is identity really is part of that core backbone of a business, and how do we, and how that is used is becoming more and more important every day. I mean, things are changing so quickly. How do you as a business react quickly when things are, when the industry is just changing so much and business is changing so much? And if you have a really like solid identity strategy and a way of approaching identity, it really unlocks a lot for your business. It's not just about risk. You can use identity to do all sorts of quite cool things that are going on at the moment.
Yeah, agreed. I think so. Keeping us on topic, moving into our next question, because we do have a habit of going down rabbit holes and talking on certain subjects for quite a long time, don't we? But I think to summarize that section, around transitions, I think the goal really is that we're ultimately, when we do these transitions, we're not removing that complexity overnight. Actually, we are looking at how we put that complexity under better control, so it feels more comfortable when we're doing it.
And the other thing is, under
So
that control and complexity, we are very much tailoring that to how organizations run. So we can look at it in different ways. So I think that is one of the key things that we see is it's each business is very different. And so it's about
one side.
doing that. It's about doing that and understanding the business, and that is complex. But how do we shape that complexity to fit your business as it's happening? Is basically a really important part.
100%. Now, we mentioned risk a few times there when we were talking, and I think, a lot of the reason that the way we transition an organization from one place to another, it's not all about migration risk being obvious, right? So we hear a lot around kind of, the words silent failure. I think one of the hardest parts when we do IAM migration is that failure isn't always this big dramatic, "Oh my god, it's all gone wrong." Sometimes it is invisible, until it's visible. So, what does silent failure look like in identity, and why is that dangerous for leadership teams? So I think in answer to that question for myself, where, where identity sits, it's massively different, I think, when you're looking at the different transformation programs that customers will have happening within their organizations. I think it's where one program may have a complete outage, actually IAM doesn't always have that outage. Sometimes you can still have access that's working, but you can have governance that's drifting. You can have life cycle changes, but they're actually not consistent in a way that they need to be. You can have controls applied in one place here in this cloud, but then bypassed completely in another. Visibility can drop just enough to make sure that actually, we don't actually know what's still happening. And I think that's dangerous because, you can look really stable on the surface, but underneath your legs are kicking like mad. So, for a board, for a CISO, for an auditor, the real question is not about, well, and we hear this a lot in security, did the lights stay on? But can we evidence that what happened because it was meant to? It happened in a way that was controlled, consistent, and actually we have full visibility from end to end of what that process was or why that happened. So when you talk to leadership teams, what advice would you give like a CISO or somebody at board level, head of IAM around, you know, what should you expect to see or what should you be asking for during these transitions? What should they be, kind of prioritizing in terms of making sure that this is safe and under control when they go through this kind of
So
transition?
I think it does come down to, I mean, it's a lot around the planning. So do we have good
Mm.
so actually picking up on actually, I think it was control, consistency, and visibility. So I think if you just pick up those three elements, I think it's what are we doing for each of those as part of the migration. So in terms of control, what's the plan? Who's in charge of that plan? What is the
Yeah.
um who are the key decision makers? What's the governance process that you're going to implement that plan by? Are we following that? Consistency is, do we? What's our approach? I guess I would link that back to, it's very easy once you get into the weeds of a project to start drifting off from like what were we supposed to be doing? Like we're getting distracted. We're finding new things. Something I think that we'll see that you'll see a lot in any migrations. You're going to find stuff that you didn't expect. Like you've done the analysis, you've done the discovery, but once you're in the weeds of it, you're going to find things. So yeah, do those actually need to be fixed now? Is that an urgent thing to be fixed now in terms of your North Star plan, your strategy, or can we put that and set it aside and say, okay, we're going to come back to that later? So it's that consistency thing of, are we executing the plan that we had? Maybe we do need to change course and do something different, but it's that constant validation of, we've got a North Star, this is our plan, we're moving through it. Are we finding new things? Do we have to action and now, or can we keep going? I think the last thing is a visibility thing. What is happening as we're making the transition? So something that we will always do and recommend with clients is really not going for that big bang, because if you do a big bang, if something is slightly off, then the whole business is impacted. So let's pick a subset of users, or let's pick a specific country or business unit. Let's start there. Let's have the visibility. Let's do the rollout. Let's learn the lessons, and then we can move on. So I think what that enables you to do, if you're looking at that consistency, visibility sort of approach, you can develop your blueprint for your organization. So what's something that we see a lot across is, let's get the plan, let's execute the plan, let's learn the lessons, let's update the blueprint, let's roll on to the next part of the process. And that is really the benefit of running in parallel, doing things doing things in stages, because you can learn as you go, and you can make sure that you know that the process is as smooth as possible. As a management team, that is what I'd be asking the program team who are actually performing this, is I want visibility of those three things, and I want you to show me how that is happening. And I also want it to happen in a staged way. I'm not going to switch over my whole organization in one big go. And I want to see the lessons that you've learned from each of those stages to make sure that we're on track.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, measurability is a key part of that, understanding, well, how do we KPI this, for example? Do we put a set of KPIs in to measure, well, what are we doing at this point in time? Have we achieved it? Why have we not achieved it? Or have we overachieved? How is that working? And I always go back to that feedback loop as well, because you can set a strategy. You can say, hey, yeah, this is what we want to achieve. You can then pass that through into an enterprise architecture setting. You can get that all designed. But actually, once you start to roll that out, that's when the real
Sure.
feedback starts to happen, right? And that needs to all come back, and it's that constant feedback loop. And that's really where, C-level need to have that visibility throughout the entire cycle of, well, how was it designed? How did it land? What went well? What didn't go well? Okay, let's come back to the drawing board. If we need to change something, let's re-strategize and let's rebuild that in something that's dynamic and that moves and grows with how it's being used and actually implemented into the
I think
business processes,
one of
right?
the things that you always forget, or sometimes gets forgotten about in these transitions and these security transitions, security is there to manage risk and to keep businesses safe and to keep data safe, but it's an enabler. So that feedback loop is so important because it's what are the actual end users, who, the people who are actually using the system, what are they actually seeing and what's happening? Because if you introduce, from a security perspective, you're looking at purely from a security perspective. If you put in controls add too much friction for the users, or is really not understandable for the users, that incentivizes them to find ways around it. So, and that actually is something that chips away at the confidence of what's going on in the business, and then adds a shadow IT, shadow failure because or quiet failure because people are like, yeah, okay, I understand that this is all going to be much more secure, but I can't use it in my day to day job. So the feedback loop is so important to make sure that you're learning those lessons as you're doing this in a staged manner because. Um,
Yeah.
the whole goal of this is to make sure that people are actually are able to use and able to work every day. If they're not able to do that, that's a failure in terms of the program.
100%. So let's go on to the next challenge then, because most organizations are not taking a really neat package of the old and moving to a really neat package of the new. We talked about that coexistence to some degree earlier. So the living in both at the same time, essentially, and the ability to have that level of coexistence and governance kind of ties into the security piece that you were talking about there as well, because you also have to consider that blast radius. Because when you're living in coexistence for longer than you expect, which in most cases you have to, how do you govern those two identity worlds at once? How do you not lose that ownership? How do you not lose that visibility? How do you not lose that control? And I think that's where migration either becomes something that's really manageable, or it's like pulling that thread and everything's starting to unravel again. Coexistence is completely normal, but unmanaged coexistence is not. And that's where the ambiguity is going to kind of creep in. That's where, we're asking questions around, well, who's actually the authoritative person or authoritative team around identity? Well, where is policy actually being enforced? Who owns the approvals, the exceptions? What happens when we've got this old control that is overlapping with a new control? And I think that from a strategy perspective, that's why the planning, that's why the operating model actually matters so much, because if nobody's actually clear on what those decisions are, what those approval routes are, what that role ownership is, how exceptions get handled, and who's actually accountable at the end of the day, that's what stalls migration. That's what makes it louder. It's what makes it riskier. And that's not a place that we really want to be in when we're doing these ion migrations. So I think when old and new identity systems have to run in parallel, what would you say are kind of some disciplines that really matter most that would help contain that blast radius? You touched on it a little bit there with the users, but how do we keep that security posture intact when we're running in coexistence?
I think it comes back to that as we were discussing earlier on. It's your first stage is like who are the owners here? Because one of the things
Yep.
that as I was mentioning before, that we always see is actually who owns these different processes, who owns the data or the applications or if you're clear about that, then you can set all of the things that you've just been talking about there. And that's why that stage of the process, right at the beginning of let's unscramble this, let's work out who the owners are. And if we don't have owners, if we've got gaps, who are they going to be? And to get people to commit to that, because that's when you get to this stage, when you're actually going through the implementation stage, as you say, that's the when the rubber is hitting the road at that point. It's who is what processes or temporary processes we're going to have in place, because we need to know who to go and talk to as we're going through it, or who is going to be responsible for monitoring it and all of that sort of stuff. So it really comes back, as you're saying there, it's the strategy, but also the planning and the data ownership is so important, because that is what gives you your guardrails, or ability to define those guardrails as the migration is happening. And I think the second part of it, so that's part one. The second part of it is, as I said, it's the controlled rollouts. You're going to create segment your business in some way to do the rollout. And as we said, there's lots of different ways to do that, but you need to be clear about how the rollout is happening. And this group of users, or this country, or this business unit has moved, but the others haven't. And what does that mean in terms of our processes and how we control? So I think it is a lot around the planning and monitoring of, like, when you're between these two things, that you understand, and it's very clear communication about, with your security teams or with your business owners, and, with your management, about this is how we've segmented it. This is how we're rolling it out, and this is how we're reporting about what's happening. And we talked about it before, but it's, again, this actually comes a lot back to the preparation stage, so that when you get to this point of, like, we're actually doing it and we're actually rolling it out, and we've got these feedback loops in and everything, it's clear who is in control at what point, and if something's happening, who we go and talk to about it. Because, or if we have, for instance, we have a group of users, like, for all the will in the world, I can guarantee that there'll be some user, some individual user somewhere, that is going to have a set of, or a combination of attributes that we're not expecting, and that we've done. You could do all the analysis in the world, but there is going to be one user who's going to be slightly different for some reason from someone else. Who do we go and talk to about that? How do we work out whether that user actually should be like that, or whether it shouldn't be like that? So it's about that preparation, and it's about understanding who you're going to go and talk to. And again, I think thinking about some of the big things that we've done, or big projects we've been involved in recently whilst you're in this migration phase, are there things going on in your business that that you don't want to disrupt at certain points? So what I mean by that is, a lot of business have seasonal activity. Is it that you have a lot of seasonal staff joining? You have students who are matriculating at a certain part of the year. You have a very busy period in terms of your business operations that you don't want to interfere with. It's about actually understanding, right, okay, we're in the middle of a migration. Perhaps switching over something during one of these events in your organization is not a good idea. So it's about that holistic thinking about how does your business run, and when are we going to carry out these different things. So yeah, these are all the types of things that a lot of people, I think, sometimes don't think about when they're managing through a migration. It's a lot of uh, organizational understanding, really, and because that gives you the control that we've talked about. Because you need that control as it's happening. You need to know what processes you're going to use as you're coexisting, because, as you say, the risk is you have two different things. You want to make sure that you don't suddenly have a hole in the middle as it's happening. So those are some of the things we see regularly when we're helping clients through this kind of process.
Yeah, totally agree. Ownership is huge. Who owns what, who's going to own what. And it's key to being able to make those decisions, to be able to move forward, to basically make sure that, coexistence is not failure. Uncontrolled coexistence is failure, right? So, and for all the architecture and governance that sits behind all of this, a lot of the programs still get stuck, and they don't get stuck because of the technology. They actually get stuck because of alignment, because of change, because of real people. They rarely fail because the technology is impossible. The technology is there, it does a good job, it does what it needs to do, but actually it stalls when there's no ownership when people can't align. Why is stakeholder alignment so often the real critical path? Well, I think in my view, it's IAM migration can't be disguised. It's not a platform program. It's an entire change for the whole organization. And actually, because it cuts across every piece of the organization, every identity that you've got within the organization, be that human, non-human, AI, whatever, we have to think about how we bring all of that together. So, all of the different areas of the business, and we see this a lot when we go into enterprise organizations. You've got security who want the control, you've got IT wanting the stability, you've got application owners who are like, just don't disrupt me, I haven't got time for this. Like, the business wants speed, 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 we've got AI, yay, we're pushing forward. And everyone's thinking about their own thing, and somebody else owns the decisions, but we're not sure who. And I think that's why executive sponsorship is so, so, so important, not just as a logo on a slide when you're presenting the strategy, or a name just above the program or whatever, but active sponsorship. Here are the priorities. Here's what the trade-offs may be or need to be. Here's the as I said earlier, the operating model decisions. This is how we're going to operate. And that is essentially what helps organizations to be more effective in terms of managing the transition with their people. So for you, what does good exec sponsorship look like? How have you had to do that alignment in the past in your experience?
It does, Stacey. I'll just follow your role here.
Said
Yeah,
it all.
I think that serious. I mean, joking aside, I think that is exec sponsorship and really having clarity. So one of the things that we do see is obviously it's interesting where identity sits in organizations sometimes, and how that is managed at an executive level of, okay, like who is actually in control of this? Is it the CIO? Is it the CISO? Is it, a head of identity? Who is it, and how did they, where do they sit? Because there will be decisions at some point that need to be made. It's going to, as you said, even within the technology groups of a business, we're going to have to make decisions, and then we're going to have to make decisions with the business, and potentially with legal or HR, or or whoever else. So the importance of exec sponsorship, but also yes, an executive who's aligned to the program and is really actively involved in that program, but equally, what does that executive, who is that executive reporting to, and how are they reporting to progress, and how do they escalate issues or highlight issues or get decision issues, because decisions across departments and potentially across countries or business units are going to have to be made. So it's for me, it's not only just about having a named executive who's there, and somebody who's actively involved in the program. It's also the business or the executive layer of the business is supportive and is giving that person the support that they need to be able to go and get decisions made. It's not the job of the executive as part of the program to mandate what's going to happen, but they need to be able to bring together the stakeholders and get decisions. So again, I don't think it's a dictator. You don't want a dictator in that role, because it is about how does the business operate, but you need to be able to reach decisions. So I think it's really important, twofold: a good executive who is proactively involved, but also that executive is empowered to bring together the necessary stakeholders and to facilitate getting to decisions to make everything successful.
Yeah, exactly. I think, especially when we see a lot of when we think about the different technologies that we've got today, when we think about identity, and we were saying, how it threads through every process, everything throughout the business. But that's the same with technology, right? Because when we are looking at the technology that is implemented into customers, quite often we're expanding from identity and access management right the way across to the network layer as well. So technology actually is owned by different teams within the organization, whether it's the cloud team, whether it's the identity and access management team, whether it's the network team, whether it's the security team, because we've got the ITDR piece as well, right? Everybody has to come along for the ride, because it impacts every single person, and having an executive from each of those areas and having this committee of people that are all on the same page, knowing what direction they want to go in to achieve the business outcomes that ultimately drive them forward is so important. Um,
I would say it's one of the most critical parts of the migration process. I mean, okay, we've got the technical
yeah,
stuff and the ownership that we've talked about and the visibility and the reporting and stuff, but that executive leadership and sponsorship really of what's going on is the thing that will make the program a success or not really, because yeah, you can't underestimate the power of having some like a team of executives who are there supportive, and what a positive impact that can make in terms of success of a program like a identity and access management migration.
yeah, true. And I think, just to wrap up this section, identity migration is, as we've said, it's only going to succeed when you've got decisions that are being made at pace at the same time as the technology is moving forward. And that really nicely kind of brings me into the next bit when we're talking about pace and technology, because we're going to talk about AI next.
Absolutely.
What would be a
Have the AI in the
fireside chat
conversation.
without AI? So, yeah, we're talking about pace, and I mean, pace has just been crazy for the last 2 years. AI has really changed the urgency at which our customers are thinking about identity and access management, right? Because AI is just accelerating everything. Automation, agentic ways of working, that is changing the way we have conversations about identity and access management migration, because it does make it more complex. It does make it more urgent to ensure that actually the foundations of our main identities that we had before AI are actually right, because AI raises those stakes massively. If your identity is already fragmented, if it's already really hard for you to be able to govern the identities that you've already got, you can't evidence, you're not meeting audit requirements, then as soon as you start layering AI agents in and automation, that's not going to simplify anything. Actually, it's going to really make it a lot more complex and a lot more difficult. So it's no longer just about how do we migrate from a legacy estate from one IDP to another, or all of those things I said about earlier. It's actually about, well, how do we make sure that we've got a credible identity control plane, that is going to exist as we move forward as a frontier firm with AI. And one of the things that I always talk about is having a coherent strategy. So it's about, how does this map from here, this type of identity, all the way over to here to this type of identity. Actually, the basis on how you discover an identity, how you observe what an identity is doing in terms of its behavior, how you, put those guardrails around an identity, around what it can and can't do. It doesn't matter whether it's human, non-human, or AI. Actually, it's all the same thing. The tools are just slightly configured differently, or you might have, slightly different portals that you're going and doing that in. But actually, it really needs to be the same sort of narrative along all of the identities, right? So, if AI is moving so fast, then leaving the rest of your identity kind of half modern, half legacy, where you've got all this AI stuff going on, it's going to become the thing that really sort of impacts the business at a later stage, because it's either going to slow you right down or it's going to stop you completely. So, I suppose, how do you think leadership should be thinking about? I mean, I've given you my perspective. It should all be thought about together. How do you think about it, Alistair, in terms of, what should people leadership be thinking about,
So
identity with AI now?
for me, so identity. I mean, really, the interesting thing about AI is it's to me it's a scale issue.
Yeah,
So one of the key challenges of AI is there's always been like non-human identities.
yeah,
There's always been human identities in systems, but what we're really talking about now is we're super maxing that in terms of the number of potential, agentic AI identities that systems are going to have to have in them, and the speed at which they could grow is quite astonishing. You start to look at the numbers. I think I saw something recently that within the next 2 years there could be like 2.3 billion agents in the world. That's a lot of new identities that organizations. And so for me, it's not the fact like, so yes, agentic and AI is all new, but the principles are the same, but they're at a much bigger scale. And the speed at which we're potentially going to see that scale appear is is quick. And then I think the other thing that management teams really need to, so that's happening. So that's the reality of what's going on. The second reality that management have to understand is it's happened. So
Yeah.
it's not the fact that this is we're now sitting waiting and thinking, right, okay, in 18 months' time, we need to think about how this is all going to work. This is happening right now, today, in your business. Like, people may not intentionally even be doing it. I mean, one of the interesting things we see when we're talking to clients is how many products that people are using are potentially using AI in them already, or using agents in them already. They may not even realize that the products that they're using are AI enabled in some way. So
And we've said about this before, haven't we? Because, my little quote line is always, um, access before control. That's how I think about all of this at the moment. Everybody has the access. Everybody's been playing around. Everybody's been looking at, how can we use AI? How can it make us more productive? And now we're really stopping and thinking, we should be controlling this in some manner, right?
for sure, and I think that's yeah, and I think that's the thing that the executives of organisations really need to be starting to think about, and
Yeah.
why I think identity is starting to really sort of resonate, because it's okay. It's sort of it's a bit of a chicken and egg in a way, in the sense of like, we want to do AI and AI is being used. Okay, we need identity to do that. So we need to actually sort out our human and non-human identities as well. So this is why I think we as an organization, you and I, Stacey, talk about it a lot, is, identity is like your new frontier, it's your new sort of backbone of your organization, because it's always been needed. But now it's really needed, and it's happening sort of beneath your feet kind of thing. It's that silent sort of thing that's happening, sort of, that you don't really realize it's happening. It sort of creeps up on you. Um, now,
You don't know what you don't know, but with identity, you never knew you needed it as much as you do now.
so I think one thing I would advise all executives to do is, and this is not just a plug for Condatis, but any way you want to do it, is get visibility of what's happening in your organization, because that's the key thing here, in terms of at executive level, of understand visibility and observability of what is going on is the way for you to actually understand the risk or the impact to your organization. At the moment, I would suspect that the majority of organizations don't really have very good visibility or observability about what is happening, in terms of how pervasive is AI in their organizations. What are they allowing, their workforce to do with AI, and who owns that AI? I mean, there's this whole thing around AI of, they are like a privileged user that's on 24/7 in your business. That's the reality of what AI is, for a lot of businesses. Is people can go home, they log off, they don't do stuff. So you can have privileged users, but these are like super privileged users that are just literally there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, um, with access to your system. So this is why I think executives need to sort of start paying attention to, not in a sort of a frightening way, as we were talking about earlier. If the fear is there because you don't know what's happening. If you know what's happening, you can take steps to mitigate it. But I think that is the challenge for executives. Is they really need to understand that it's happened, it's going on in your organisation. And I think the last bit, I know I'm rambling on, but the last bit, because this is a topic that we talk about a lot, Stacey. Um, the last bit is, and we were talking about it earlier, about actually during other type, like during migrations of, if you don't have a good strategy and you're having point in time security solutions, there's a real danger of gaps. So if you have different types of identities in your system, so you have your human, your non-human, now you've got agentic AI. If you don't have a good strategy and you're not thinking about this, this is where gaps appear, in terms of, you don't know what your coverage is.
Yeah.
And so that's another silent sort of sort of problem for organizations is if you don't have a good strategy, a good platform with good continuous evaluation going on all the time, you don't know where the gaps are, basically, and that's where you get problems.
And ultimately, if you're doing the management of your AI agents over here, you're doing the management of your human agents over here, and the governance, of course, then, you know, what about that bit in between? Because your humans have got a whole bunch of permissions to do whatever they need to do, and perhaps more on some occasions. But um, actually, those agents are on behalf of those humans. They're inheriting those permissions. So you need that unified visibility to be able to see what's actually happening from user to agent, agent to agent. What are those relationships and how are they interacting? What are they sharing? What are they doing? What's the behavior that's happening between them? And the only way that you're going to do that is to have something that is coherent across all of those different identity types. So that's why the strategy is so important. To get to those business outcomes, to enable the business in the way that you want to with AI, to become that frontier firm. You can't operate in silo when it comes to the different identity types. You've really got to be thinking about all up strategy across the board.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the, the thing that we need to realize is that yes, they're a computer program running in your system as an AI, but they need their own life cycle. People have their own life cycle. Non-human identities have their own life cycle. How do all those things work? Like we know from looking and working with organizations that one of the big things that we always see when we're talking to people is that thing of permissions creep. Like you've got an employee who's been with you for 20 years, they've changed role 10 times, they've got permissions to things they really shouldn't have permissions to. That's exactly the same problem we're going to have with agentic AI, this is why a consolidated view and a consolidated strategy across these identities is so important because it's how do they all interact with one another, and how are we going to manage those in a consistent way? Because if you think about an agent, it could be sitting there for if you unless you manage that life cycle, that agent will be there forever doing stuff. So how are we going to retire that agent? How are we going to monitor that agent to see whether it's working within the guardrails that we want it to work? And if the person who created it leaves the organization, who owns it? So in case we need to actually switch it off or go and ask somebody about what that agent is doing, like we need to have that consolidated view. It's just so important at the moment with the speed of everything that's happening. I think the last thing I'd say on this sort of question is I think this is where you sort of mentioned it before as limiting blast radius and why identity is so important is proactivity. What identity and access management gives you is proactivity. You're not waiting for something to happen. We can't guarantee 100% the system is secure. If you're proactive and you're thinking and you've got your strategy in place and you're thinking about the controls and you're thinking about the life cycles, then the blast radius is very much reduced if something does happen in your system and you're being proactive about it rather than reactive. It's better to be proactive than having to try and tidy it up once something is really major has happened in your organization.
Yeah, 100%. So to tie up, to close off, the real risk around migration is not the migration itself. It's actually when it's unmanaged. That's what that's the clear message I think that we've given today is, put the control there, put the guardrails there, manage it in a way that's comfortable, that suits your organization for what you're looking to achieve, and it will be successful. And I think if there's one thing that I wanted anybody to take away from what we've been talking about today, you know, IAM migration should not be approached as a leap from old to new. Actually, it should be approached in a controlled manner where we transfer trust, where we transfer policy, where we transfer accountability. And it's the organizations that do this well, that are the ones that are gonna succeed. And I think where we get a clear operating model, where coexistence happens in a way that's governable, where we can evidence what we're doing, where we've got that assurance, where we've got that visibility, actually change isn't something that people need to be fearful of. It's managed and it's easy to move through, and you can bring your people, those real human beings that are part of this whole process, not just the systems, along for that journey. And I think that's where actually migration stops being this whole fear story, and starts becoming more around, a strategy story, which is the best kind of story I like. So yeah, if you're a CISO, if you're a CTO, if you're head of IAM and you're sat there on a platform that you're thinking I need to migrate from and I need to migrate from it like yesterday, then what's the first move that you're gonna make to turn that migration from something that you're sat there currently thinking, ooh, about right now into a program that actually feels more controlled and more comfortable and allows you to transform in a way that enables the business to grow and move forward, with identity underpinning the whole of it. Um, and yeah, Alistair, anything that you kind of want to ask or leave a pause for thought with?
I think it is just making change with confidence. I think that's the whole. What, if you plan a IAM migration, as we've been talking about, and you take into consideration some of the things that we've been talking about, you can really approach it with confidence. And you can approach it with confidence both through executive team in terms of this is how we're approaching it, this is how we're reporting it, and this is how we're planning it, and now this is how we're doing it. To also, the confidence that you're doing it in a manner that minimizes the risks. You're aware of the gaps. You're doing it in a controlled manner. I think Stacey said earlier, it's all about control. There's no need to be fearful if you have control, and that gives you and if you have control, you have confidence to go through the migration.
And I think that wraps up my debut at Condatis, my third fireside, with you, Alistair. So thanks for your time today. Really enjoyed this chat with you.